Okay, so our first presenter is Ashley Gibson, who's currently pursuing her MA in art history at UO with a focus in contemporary art. Her master's thesis includes the categorization and classification of distribution platforms for artist video with a focus on issues of access, circulation, and reception. She's researching electronic arts intermix as a primary case study to analyze how distribution and preservation of artist video and new media art has changed from the 1960s to the era of the internet, and the ways in which technologies are outliving the means with which to view them. And there's Robert in the back. Robert, thank you. Okay, after that interlude, Bryce Peak is currently a graduate student in the anthropology department where he does work in social and media semiotics. His research focuses on the ways sound affects, reflects, and is used to overcome cultural anxieties over gender, race, time, and space. He's published research on the ethnic and gender politics of listening in Gibraltar and Malta, the psychodynamic effects of groaning in zombie walks, my favorite. And more recently, he's begun work examining the impact of video game technology on the gender and racial stability of white domestic space. I'm sorry, Whitney. I have the spelling of your name that you sent me. Whitney Phillips, not Wapme, is a third-year English PhD with a structured emphasis in folklore. She studies online culture, specifically transgressive humor within trolling subcultures, and is particularly interested in the constitutive aspects of viral humor, the meta-communicative signaling necessary to subcultural formation, and approaches to online content that attempt to bypass traditional accounts of individual artists, authors. Recent projects include an explication of post-irony, a comedic aesthetic inherent to, and as she argues, necessitated by online discourse, a discussion of the Obama Joker socialism macro, and several accounts of trolling behaviors, both on 4chanB and Facebook memorial pages. And here again, we're going to have to ask you not to tweet during Whitney's presentation because of problems with the trolling community and her need to continue her research within that community without retribution. And I'm sure she can talk more about that in the Q&A as long as you don't tweet about it. Stacy Tucker, will you wave, Stacy? She's on the end, is a master's candidate of communication in society in the School of Journalism and Communication at UO. Stacy worked for over 10 years in online management, web design, and development for various industries, including newspapers, film and education. Her research interests include gender and queer expressions in new media, particularly video games, immersive virtual environments, social and independent media. And she's doing this awesome study of harassment in online gaming. Mara Williams is currently pursuing her PhD in Communication and Society through the School of Journalism and Communication. In 2009, she received her MA in Media Studies from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Her master's thesis examined transgender-produced autobiographical video blogs on YouTube. Her current research interests include misogyny in video game communities, world building and fan production, and queer-run digital spaces. I'll turn it over to Ashley now.
So hello, and thank you to Carol again for putting this panel together. As she mentioned, I am currently working on a master's thesis that examines the history of distribution platforms in artist video. I'm defining the term artist video as any time-based art form that employs the medium of film, videotape, digital video, or any combination thereof. So I'm going to begin with just a short video clip and will then explain some of the goals of my research, questions I'm asking, look at this typology that I've constructed in order to categorize artist video, and then we'll give some examples of each platform. So the 30-second clip I'm about to show you deserves a brief introduction. It's from Martha Rossler's Semiotics of the Kitchen, which is a landmark video, a feminist parody dating to 1975, which features the artist herself as sort of a generic television cooking show host. Rossler presents us with an array of kitchen hand utensils, which she describes in alphabetical order, A to Z, and demonstrates uses for each utensil that are either violent or unproductive, so it's pretty funny. So I just want you to note, too, that I'm pulling this very important work of art up from YouTube. So here you go. That's an ice pick, if you didn't hear.
Juicer. Knife. Ladle.
So you get the picture, and she goes on through the rest of the alphabet. So again, I want to make the point that, in 1975, when this artwork was originally created, in order for us to view it, for any one of us, we would have to hope that an art institution nearby was exhibiting her work. But today, we can easily access it on YouTube, on Google Video, UbuWeb, and many other websites. So this raises a series of important questions that I'm interested in. One is, do we still need art museums? Is the physical site of an exhibition relevant? Who are the gatekeepers of art and culture at this point? Or in other words, if this work exists outside of an art institution, does it still exist as a work of art? So although much has already been written on the history of artist video, there's a lack of scholarship surrounding how we access it and how it changes as we view it in different contexts. So rather than focusing on the details of specific artworks or artists, I'm attempting to classify and organize methods of distribution with the end goal that we can better talk and think about this kind of artwork going forward. But hopefully my work is getting at something even broader than the art historical field or art curation, but can go on to address issues such as medium specificity. So does medium specificity exist anymore? Or how has exhibition and distribution just in general changed in the era of the internet? So again, I'm looking at ways to classify these different methods of distribution and examine convergence between the different platforms. The way in which I'm using the term distribution platform is a little necessary to clarify. I see this as the point of access between a product and a user, or between the artwork and an audience. So for commercial video, for example, Netflix and Hulu are well-known distribution platforms, or more specifically, digital distribution platforms. For my own research, I have determined 3 macro-level platforms for artist video. The first is television, the second is institution, and the third is internet as platform. So I have a few examples for each. Just some historical background in terms of television as platform. Television is actually associated with the beginnings of artist video in the 1960s and 1970s. Many pioneering video collectives used this as their original means of distribution. They would use public access or cable broadcast to access people right in their living rooms. One example of this, somebody that employs television as a platform, is Paper Tiger Television. They are a nonprofit, open artist video collective that was founded in 1981. Their main goal is to create alternative media coverage, and they continue to broadcast via public access television today. One can actually purchase or rent a DVD or VHS version of their videos via their website. And recently they partnered with an independent video rental service to allow users to stream their videos online for a small fee. In addition, Paper Tiger posts new videos on their website each week in the form of sort of a video blog, so one can watch those via an embedded Vimeo player. So my point in bringing this up is this group has recently embraced the internet as a platform to distribute and exhibit their work while maintaining television as their regular means of distribution. This is interesting in terms of classification. One more contemporary even example to show you is Souvenirs from Earth, which is a cable television station currently broadcasting out of France and Germany that is dedicated to 24 hours of artist video. This is very different from early video collectives of the 60s and 70s or Paper Tiger, since souvenirs got their start from within the art institution world and also has ties to advertising and fashion. What's interesting too about souvenirs is the reason, according to them, that their project is made possible is due to the digital revolution in television broadcasting, which has freed up bandwidth for special interest programming. The second platform for artist video is institution. This includes obviously art institutions, galleries, other structured sorts of organizations. Here are two images of early artist video as shown on television monitors, but within an art institutional space. So as technology has changed, so have exhibition methods. Many institutions are now currently utilizing flat screen monitors in their galleries, such as the one seen on the right from an exhibition just last year. Here are two images of artist video exhibited with the use of flat screen projections. These video screen installations, as you can see, create more of an architectural sort of environment for the viewer. The audience often experiences them physically or are encouraged to engage them in some sort of way. So it's important to note that this differs very greatly than both television and internet as platform. Art institutions require that you physically be present at the location in order to view this art. This is especially interesting in terms of access because not everybody can travel to the places in which this art is being shown. So the third platform, again, that I'm looking at is the internet. UbuWeb is a great example of an organization that uses the internet as platform. UbuWeb, I'm sure most of you know, is an independent online repository for film, video, literature, poetry, and many other things. One can access an incredible amount of work through their searchable database. And one additional example that I want to mention that falls within this internet platform category is Rhizome. Rhizome originally began in 1996 as an email listserv for new media artists and interested parties, and now is an online community that is dedicated to the creation, preservation, and presentation of art practices that engage new technologies, including artist video. Many of you are probably familiar with Rhizome as a scholarly community or as a sounding board, but I just want to point out that they also have a searchable art base or art database that contains over 2,500 new media and some video artworks. Oops. So when we view artist video on something like UbuWeb, we're not actually viewing the original artwork in this case. We're viewing a compressed, low-quality file of the work. So this absolutely alters our experience of the piece. In addition to the work itself being altered, we need to consider how our experience changes from, for example, watching the entire 6 minutes of Rossler's Semiotics in the Kitchen, where it's screened at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, versus some of you watching it maybe later tonight on your couch from your laptop. So does watching these artworks from our laptops depart from, say, the artist's original intent? And in that case, does the artist's original intent matter? So the ability for artworks to exist outside of the traditional art institution is exciting and offers artists an opportunity for institutional critique, and its audiences a slightly more democratic opportunity to access. And I say slightly more democratic because I'm obviously not addressing here statistics of how many of us regularly have access to the internet in general. So without UbuWeb or Rhizome, most people would never have the opportunity to access the work that is contained there. Furthermore, without digitization, Rossler's work would eventually deteriorate and be lost forever, along with the antiquated technology originally used to view it. So what do we lose, though, from the internet as a platform and from continually converting these originals into new formats, both in terms of sound but also in terms of visuals? So perhaps the idea of collecting, preserving, and providing free open source access and encouraging open collaboration is what is most important for these platforms. But again, what do we lose? So these are the questions that I'm continuing to investigate. Thank you.
little bit so I don't have music. Can everybody hear me fine? Good? All right. Now to find a place for the iPad so I don't mash buttons. All right, so this is an interesting juxtaposition because we move on from some really interesting high video art to a little bit more of a profane type of video art, the video game. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the ways in which cutting-edge video game technology, specifically the Xbox Kinect, has pushed the gentrification of rap and hip-hop to a different level. And I'm going to be talking about Dance Central, the cover here, which is both the premier hip-hop, rap, funk, soul dance game for the Xbox Kinect, and also being described as the premier title for the launch. Kinect just came out November 4th, I believe. I'm going to be looking specifically at the ways in which remastering, the remastering that went into the tracks was not just a neutral activity. I'll argue instead that it was informed, consciously or otherwise, by the media industry's imagining of the domestic space as by default white. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the Kinect. The Kinect is a controller-free gaming entertainment experience as it's described by Microsoft Xbox 360. It gives players the ability to control and interact with the Xbox 360 and the gaming environment without the need to touch a game controller. It's done through motion and voice. In an interview with Computer and Video Games Magazine on June 22nd, 2010, Microsoft announced, quote, "We're developing controller-based games for the core and Kinect titles that appeal to everyone." Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer later clarified with some pretty sexist comments that he meant the whole family. Although I haven't been able to track down exact demographic data because Microsoft hasn't really been willing to share it, I think we can do some interesting acrobatics to figure out who this was engineered for. First, we can take Ballmer's comment that it's meant for the family and juxtapose it with the fact that 85% of Xboxes recorded last year are owned by white males between the ages of 15 and 38, and that the device costs a decent amount of money and requires a pretty large space to play in. We're looking at a white middle-class demographic. Add to this the fact that Kinect's facial recognition system can't realize dark-skinned people, and that Microsoft failed to find this in the beta testing, and we have some pretty convincing evidence who the Kinect was engineered for, primarily a white audience. Now this is essential information for understanding Kinect aesthetics and the aesthetic domain that the Kinect demands from games. In moving to talking about Dance Central specifically, I want to say a few more things theoretically about how the Kinect works. Turn this volume off. Oh, you don't have to. So you can see how it's working here, and I'll just keep going. Kinect is by no means the first body controller. We can go all the way back to 8-bit NES, the gamepad from that system, and even some hacked Atari experiments for different examples. It is, however, the first successful attempt to remove the controllers from the console in such a way that the space represented in the TV and the space of the home collapse on one another. Put differently, it is the first machine that cuts the wires to the TV, giving us direct access to the screen world. In this way, the name of the device is pretty revealing, combining the word Kinect with the image of the word kinetic. The Kinect is intended to make us move, and in so doing, we connect the screen world and the physical world. Chris Berry, So-Young Kim, and Lynn Spiegel have all previously theorized this connection between mediated and lived spaces. They call this an electronic elsewhere, a concept that reveals the transformative relationship between media and space and destabilizes the dichotomy of virtual and physical space in light of experiencing both. What the concept does for us is reveal that, quote, the media do not just represent a place that is already there. Rather, places are conjured up, experienced, and in that sense produced through the media, end quote. The Kinect, as I see it, transforms the domestic space in the sense that we can no longer talk about the world I'm playing the video game in and the world the video game constructs as entirely separate things. By using our bodies to control the avatar on the screen, we are effectively in both worlds, and by transforming our space into the controller, the screen world is effectively in the physical world. To draw upon another game that I'm writing about, when a tiger cub runs around me in the game Kinectimals, which is a type of virtual pet game, I can follow the sound of the tiger 360 degrees around my living room on 7.1 Dolby Digital. Though through sound, not least of all, the screen world is inscribed on physical space. The Kinect game space is liminal. It sits betwixt and between the digital and the physical. As comm theorist Eric Rothenbuehler reminds us, liminality is a very dangerous thing when it comes to communicative activities. Much discomfort is generated in loosely constructed communication architecture. When the screen and the space collapse, people feel uncomfortable inevitably. Tying this back to Connect, games require the construction of a safe space for this liminality to occur, a space safe for white middle-class families, as the demographic data suggests to us. So with that in mind, I'm going to move to talking about Dance Central in particular, and specifically the racialized aesthetics that are going into the remastering of tracks for the game. I'd like you to think of remastering in terms of regulating space. Big concert hall versus inner city school versus nightclub. What would music recorded in these spaces sound like? And this is not just about reverberation, but also background noises. Remastering focuses on adjusting both in order to translate the content of a track from the aesthetic context and technological possibilities of yesterday to the aesthetic norms of today, or at least the aesthetic nostalgia of today. Working from the assumption that the act of remastering is as political as it is aesthetic, I'm going to focus on the ways remastering is used in Dance Central, a game that transforms the middle-class living room into an inner-city school-made dance hall while mimicking the acoustic conditions of a concert hall. Now I'm going to be focused on the sounds and the songs specifically, with little attention to content. I will say, of course, content is important. No parent would buy Dance Central if their kids were getting down to NWA and screaming "fuck the police" over and over. But what the development team of Dance Central did was more than just choose safe content. They also edited that content to make it safer, which involved deleting sonic aspects of specific songs. And here I'll just start this clip so you can see what happens in Dance Central. The reason for that deletion is that there is a danger of compromising the pre-existent racial stability of the domestic space, regardless of how white-friendly a song's lyrics may be. Hip-hop, as a purely sonic referent to other races and other places, presents a danger to the white middle-class domestic sphere by sounding like otherness, even if that other group is a group of Jewish kids from Brooklyn, as will be my case here in a second. The question for game creators now is, how do we make the music safe for the home, either consciously or otherwise? The answer was we censor the content. In my interest, take out sounds that stir up and bring up effects of racial danger. As Lauren Kajikawa suggests in terms of making Eminem a white rapper, rather than simply transcending racial boundaries, Eminem had to negotiate them in ways that made sense to his audiences. Remastering, then, was more than just a neutral editing to make tracks sound better. It was a way to negotiate the blackness of hip-hop and the whiteness of the domestic space. So here I want to compare the two tracks for you, and I'll turn the volume up. With some extra moves going on. And there seems to be another track playing. Let's find out where that video is. Stop that. Alrighty. And so let's compare that that Dance Central clip to the original track.
Ready? 1. You will do this 4 times with the left, 4 with the right, then 8 times with both. Then we...
So just to give you a sample so I can keep going, I don't want to play the whole track, although I kind of do want to play the whole track. So what's the difference? Well, missing from the Dance Central version are electronic noises of tape reel spinning, of construction work happening, and as you heard in this clip, steel drums being played. Why? Well, let's look at the noise as it's described. Reviewing the original album was one Amazon.com user who said, quote, "The constant clutter of electronic noise and samples makes it sound like the studio was as ghetto as the style of music the boys attempted." End quote. What's important is to recognize the relationship drawn between the background noise and the ghetto, an incredibly racialized description of space, obviously. Numerous other reviews follow suit in understanding of sounds as racialized, not least of all the steel drums. What we can break down from the comments is an understanding that 2 noises are missing. Those that obviously signify blackness, such as the steel drums, and the production noises. Well, the first one is obvious because it brings up images of blackness. The second, however, is an interesting one to deal with. They're not just production noises. They're also racialized. 1930s critics of jazz articulated their contempt in a curious conjunction of racism and anti-mechanism. In a 1921 article titled, "Does Jazz Put the Sin in Syncopation?" Anshaw Faulkner suggests that jazz reflects, quote, "an impulse for wildness," end quote, even as it was, quote, "perfectly adapted for robots," end quote. It was, quote, "the musical reflection of modern capitalistic industrialism." In the 1930s society, where apotheosis was signified by efficiency, sound was a sign of the inefficient, clunky labor. Jazz was the racialized vehicle for condemning noise pollution, while industrial noise was the vehicle for condemning jazz. Tying this back to Connect and Dance Central, those ghetto noises, those mechanical, racialized noises of the evil black community being posed, are taken out. The Connect uses sound to inscribe a new space on the household, and those ghetto sounds run the danger of making the home a ghetto, a space not safe for and antithetical to the whiteness of the target demographic. If there was ever a question as to the degree at which racialization of noise lives on in the aesthetic imagination, Connect shows us that racialized aesthetics are central to our supposedly post-racist acoustic imagination. So here I'll conclude. The Connect presents a destabilization of the domestic space, and as such, games are required to take care not to render that space dangerous. If, as in electronic elsewhere, the Connect imports a new space into the home, that space has to be resonant with the white middle-class values of its consumers. And inevitably, it will be. As Lynn Spiegel has contended in her work on television, when the media industry is asked to imagine or reconstruct the public and/or domestic sphere, they do so in the image of the white urban suburb they themselves created in the 50s. The new media form, despite its possibilities to create a racial consciousness, is used to reproduce the sphere of whiteness. Thank you.
Hello, I am Stacy, and I am Luke Skywalker to Whitney's Darth Vader. I'm going to talk to you about my research about harassment, discrimination, and use of derogatory language in online games. And because harassment, discrimination, and use of derogatory language is a mouthful, I'm just going to refer to it as griefing, which is essentially the video game version of trolling. It's much easier to say. So cue self-reflexivity. I am a lesbian gamer. I've been gaming since the 80s. And I was very interested in a story in February of 2009 about a lesbian on Xbox Live that was harassed to the point of tears for being out in her Xbox Live profile. And when she appealed to Microsoft, she was banned. She was banned because she violated the terms of use, which prohibited any mention of sex or sexuality in gamer tags, which are essentially aliases in Xbox Live, and on their profile. And I thought it was very interesting that Microsoft also mentioned that heterosexuals were prohibited from being out as heterosexuals. And I am shocked that more heterosexuals were not outraged. But you will be happy to know that as of March of 2010, you can now wave your rainbow flag with pride. They have since changed their policy. So this is where I justify doing research on video games. According to Pew, most U.S. adults are playing video games, and that number spikes when you're looking at 35 and under. And 21% of gamers are playing daily or almost daily, which has propelled the U.S. video game industry to $21 billion in sales in 2008, and that went down a little bit in the last couple of years, as it did in most entertainment industries due to our hard economic times. For those of you who don't know or aren't gamers, massively multiplayer online games are persistent games, networked games online that you can enter at any time, barring the occasional outage, where you can play with players, with or against other players that you may know in real life or may not. And there's been a lot of studies about the social relationships that have formed in MMOs, that they are akin to third places, such as clubs or churches, so places where you would form close relationships, and very close relationships are formed in MMOs. There are definitely sites of a social community. 54% of gamers played online in 2010. That's the entire gaming audience, and that's up from 19% in 2000. And due to the growing popularity of online games, recent trends are showing that most games will be going online in the very short future. So we've really kind of gotten away from the stereotype of the gamer as a 16-year-old socially awkward boy playing Xbox and downloading porn in his parents' basement. The gamer audience has grown significantly more diverse. 40% of all game players are women, and they outnumber men in the 25 to 34-year-old game bracket. And a lot of qualitative studies have showed that women, like men, are playing for competition, not for escapism or relaxation. However, the target audience still remains largely male, and men still pretty much dominate the game development industry. So as a result, women are highly underrepresented in video game content and are vastly more likely to be sexualized. There's not a lot of research on race and ethnicity among the gamer audience, but there's significant research on racial stereotyping within video game content, evident in Grand Theft Auto, evident in many, many popular war games. But I was unable to find almost any mention of non-whites actually playing video games, which they do in mass. So hopefully there's more research done on that in the future. And gamers, same problem. Apparently gay people don't play video games. There's not really a lot of research on it. However, there's been controversy about the content, such as with Rockstar's Bully, which instead of focusing on the playground violence, there was a lot of controversy over the fact that the player's male avatar could kiss both boys and girls. And BioWare and Mass Effect drew a lot of fire because women could have sex with other women in the game. Of course, it wasn't it was sort of disguised. But men couldn't have sex with men, and for a temporary period of time they banned sexual orientation as a topic on their forums because actually people were going online and saying derogatory things about gay people, not because they wanted to prohibit people from talking about how much it sucked, that this was restrictive. However, in Dragon Age, which is another BioWare game, they opened it back up to the full sexual orientation spectrum. But they never changed Mass Effect. So in my study, I did a mixed method because I wanted to look at the pervasiveness of harassment and griefing. I forgot I was just going to say griefing. Griefing in video games, but I also wanted to talk to players and find out about how this affected their experience in play. So I did an online survey, and I also asked people in the survey to volunteer for an interview, and then I conducted a series of interviews. And I'm still gathering research, so a lot of the numbers that I've crunched at this point are just with a preliminary sample. However, that sample has revealed that nearly everyone who responded to the online survey and everyone that I interviewed admitted to encountering griefing online far more than they encountered harassment, discrimination, or use of derogatory language offline, that it was a regular part of play for them. However, most dismissed it as an aspect of competitive play or an aspect of the anonymity of just playing online. However, demographics, which is interesting, gamers have more in common than not. Demographics played no role in the skill level of the players. It played no role in their genre preference. It played no role in how often they played. So men and women's motivators were almost identical. It's identical among sexual orientation and among race and ethnicity. However, women were significantly more likely to completely end play when they encountered griefing. And during the interviews, I found out that for few of the women, it was because it triggered feelings of safety concerns, physical safety concerns, and it triggered a real deep emotional reaction. So they had to actually completely stop playing in order to sort of calm down and step away and sort of regain feelings of personal safety. Heterosexual players were significantly more likely to attack abusive players as a conflict resolution strategy than gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer players. So here are some of the interviews, the quotes from the interviews that I thought was interesting. This woman spoke about the very, very close friendships she's formed in MMOs, that she paid someone's rent for 2 months and they repaid her with tickets to Prague, and that her friendships have carried through several games over the years. So I just wanted to include this as sort of testimony to how close the friendships and the relationships people form in these online games. This quote is from a 31-year-old Asian bisexual action genre player. I definitely hear the use of hate terms. I'm a bisexual Asian American female whose oldest child of black descent. So when I see someone being hateful, I usually make sure I don't play with that person again. Players are aggressive in FPS's first-person shooters that I play and will curse and call people names to anger the other person because they're not face-to-face. I don't see a racist coming into my neighborhood and starting some stuff, but since they are safe in their homes, they feel free to talk crap. And I included this quote for a couple of reasons. One, it really reflects on how many people just dismiss the griefing they encounter online as an inevitable part of playing online, and they don't question it. In fact, a lot of people said that, well, I don't encounter harassment, but I hear people say, you know, fag all the time, directed at me, and don't regard that as harassment. They just regard that as a part of the online environment. So it was really actually difficult to get any of my interview subjects to talk about harassment because they didn't consider it harassment. I also wanted to mention this because it spoke to how a lot of women use online games, particularly mothers, as a way to socialize and as a way to play, which they often don't have the time in their lives to do in real life. I'm actually not going to say this out loud because it makes me uncomfortable. But this is yet another quote that really talks about trolling online and excuses it as just a regular part of competing and sports and play. And this is another person I had a hard time getting to actually admit that any of it was harassment. It was just hate speech, but not harassment. This is my favorite quote from all of my interviews. Gay seems like a synonym for of poor quality rather than queer, but it's not meant in a hurtful way. And I'm not even going to bother unpacking that. I think that quote sort of speaks for itself. This is one of my favorite interview subjects, 20-year-old white heterosexual U.S. action genre player. She is a very active player. She plays a lot with her boyfriend. It's their favorite date. And I found her very interesting because she freely admitted to using hate speech in her playing. She considered it a strategy, and she considered it part of the fun. And I asked her point blank if she felt like she would enjoy the playing experience as much if she weren't allowed to use terms like fag. And she said, no, I would enjoy playing it as much. And then she said, no, I probably wouldn't. And then she backpedaled again and said, oh, no, I can enjoy it as much. But it was really obvious that she was really conflicted about it because on one side of her brain you could tell that she knew it was wrong, but on the other side, to her, it was such an ingrained part of play, and she had wholly embraced it, that she participated in it, that it was hard for her to imagine playing without it. And this quote from a male 23, white heterosexual action genre player, talks about how when he switched from consoles to PC, he felt like he encountered griefing less. And I threw this quote in because console playing is significantly more popular among a younger demographic. PC, so personal computer online game playing, is significantly more popular among an older demographic. So I think some of these quotes, which I won't have time to really look into this study, that a lot of this behavior may be more popular among the younger console playing demographic than it is among the older population. But I don't know that for sure. So some discussion items related to this research is how trolling and griefing, which is a phenomenon absolutely worthy of research, Whitney, how that affects sort of these online communities and acceptable behavior in online communities, as well as the fact that online games, while sites for social communities, are still games. So how sort of the psychology of competition and the pleasure of competition plays a role in behavior online and in online games. But I worry because if you think about video games as sort of a gateway drug to careers in technology, and if any of these online play environments are discouraging women, gays, lesbians, bisexual, queers, or non-whites from playing video games, how does this impact sort of the future makeup, the demographic makeup of the future video game building community? And that is all. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I was really worried about going last, but I'm actually really glad I went last now because, here, I have to get this to go full screen for me here. Hold on a second. No, that's not it.
No more. There you go.
There we go. All right. So, so my name is Mara Williams. I'm also in the J School, and I'm glad I'm going last because I'm also talking about video games. I'm also talking about race and gender and about troll bait in a little bit. But so I'm working on a couple of things for my larger dissertation research, but this is actually a project that I'm just beginning. So I beg your forgiveness for presenting something that's not as well developed as some of the other projects, but I think it's important to look at sort of the range of the kind of digital scholarship that's being produced here and to acknowledge sometimes it's exciting to talk about something new. So this is a project that I've been working on for possible inclusion in a conference this summer, and it's called Unicorns and Fat Princesses, Post-Feminist Discourse in the Gamer-Girl Debate. And I'm going to switch back and forth between girl gamer and gamer girl, just because I haven't given this talk enough in order to have disciplined myself into one or the other. But basically, I'm interested in, because I'm also a video gamer, and I'm also have been doing research on video games, but more in this sort of textual vein and looking at avatars and looking at sexual expression and gameplay and things like that. And in the course of doing a talk at a fan conference, got exposed to a lot of sort of fan gamer identity discourse, and it really intrigued me in the ways that women especially were identifying themselves and interacting with the kinds of myths about who's a gamer and the ways that the resistance to that myth doesn't necessarily get to a sort of satisfying conclusion, and we'll get to that. But first, just to go over, like, there's the thing we say, the myth of the gamer girl. If you Google that, there's a lot of kind of, the fan term we say is wankery, but there's a lot of wankery about this. So people starting threads and blogs and tweets and all kinds of things, but there's just a lot of concern over whether or not it's okay to be a girl and a gamer. Can you be feminine and game? Can you be beautiful and can you game? And all of these things. And given, as Stacy pointed out, and actually I want to thank you for having your research up there because I have it in my notes, but now I don't even have to cite it. But the ESA data about that 40% of women, 40% of gamers are women, that there are more women gamers over the age of 18 than there are young male gamers, even though the persistent sort of hegemonic stereotype about who a gamer is still white and heterosexual and male and young and a console gamer. And that's the sort of the real gamer. And that's the kind of terrain that we're working in. And I'm sure that some of you are going to be familiar with this video. It's a viral video from this past September, produced by a group called Team Unicorn, which is made up of 4 actresses and producers, people who are sort of variously involved in being publicly geeky, and also women. And Seth Green is involved. So there's a lot of sort of flashing of geek cultural capital happening here. But I want to give a few seconds of this so you'll, and it looks like we're going to start a little bit in the middle of it, but that's fine because it's really all the same. So here we go.
Hello, friends. Don't you want to meet a nice girl?
I know a place where the gamers girls are so extreme. D&D, where Randall Force still reigns supreme. Questing in a room, dominating Final Fantasy. Boys, sleep.
What up, news?
That's really enough. It goes on. There's about 4 minutes of it, but you can see the argument that can be made, and that was made by girl gamers of the sort of the very narrow range of sort of possible roles for women gamers. And even though the text, if you listen to the lyrics, there's a lot of flashing of obscure gaming, not necessarily obscure gaming references, but like credible gaming references. But it's coupled with naked women laying on top of games with things. I mean, I don't even know how to describe this video because as a girl, as I don't identify as a girl gamer, but as a person who games, it's very problematic. But it does very succinctly outline some of the problems with the narrow range of images and roles for women within sort of the discourse about what it is to be a gamer. And if you look at the men, who by the way were all white in this video, the range of body types is larger. They're moving more, and they aren't at a slumber party. So, but the point of this is not to critique the narrow range of images available to women, even though that is certainly up for critique, and there are a lot of people doing that. What I want, and here's another example. This is the Geek of the Week trading card that an artist is doing, Len Peralta, I believe is his name. But it's sort of a canonical, like, Woodstock geek pantheon, and there are far more men than women, far more white people than people of color, and you can see here from two people involved in Mythbusters the difference between how gender is kind of what images are offered. But like I said, I want to move away from representation and just talking about representation and move into how the debate over representation can be problematic in itself. So after the Geek and Gamer Girls was posted, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not you could be beautiful and be a gamer, whether or not you could be feminine and be a gamer. But, and that's all discussion that should happen, but the terms of the debate were really constrained through the logic of post-feminism. So instead of appealing to the narrow range of images caused by, say, patriarchy or misogyny or any other number of sort of structural limits on our imagination, instead it was all about consumer choice. It's like, well, if you don't like that avatar, then you don't buy it, and about your own performance and your own individual experience. And so that was what was offered up in defense. And I find this incredibly problematic. So I've been using the logic of post-feminism to describe this. I think it describes it very well. Post-feminism as a way to describe the cultural moment where feminism, as McRobbie says, is taken into account and then quickly dismissed. But it is not, it's not feminist. And actually, we have McRobbie quote there that's bandied about a bit. But feminism seen as something that is over with, that women no longer need because we have achieved empowerment and therefore we're free to engage in as much sexist rhetoric and individual choice as we want. And actually, Susan Douglas has called this new sexism or enlightened sexism in order to kind of get out of the confusion of using the word post-feminist, which every time I try to use this word, they're like, but aren't you a feminist? And it's like, yes, I'm a feminist. But this is a different thing. So we can think about it as new sexism, we can think about it as post-feminism, but the main thing is to have a theoretical framework that can critique the appeal to individual experience as the kind of arbiter of structural violence and inequality instead of these things. So it's you know, has a lot in common with post-racial logic, and I think there's something to be said also with critiquing not only the narrow range of images and of roles available for women in gaming communities and discourse about women gamers, but about whiteness in gaming communities. And that's something that, as Stacy mentioned, is really understudied, and I'm interested in looking at that. And here there's an example of the wankery. This is from an article online called "The Gamer Girl Must Die." And it contains some of that post-feminist rhetoric, the call to individual experience, the call that talking about gender, talking about racial inequality is somehow divisive. So she says, ladies, I ask you, and fellow gamers, I ask you, why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we doing this to our gaming culture? Why can't we just respect each other as people and as gamers and let that be it? And she goes on, but this is the call to stop talking about gender and instead to think of ourselves as gamers only. And that's often the call when a discussion about women in games happens. It's very post-feminist. It's very familiar to many of us who study culture. But the other thing that I want to do is to think about possibilities for resistance, because, again, as Stacy mentioned, as other people have mentioned throughout the day, it's not an inevitable way to talk about geek culture as automatically masculine and automatically white and automatically straight. There are other sites where people are creating spaces and articulating a different position and a different identity. And even though I might find the whole gamer girl identity discourse boring, which I do, there's a lot of interesting work being done to redefine the sort of the terrain of geek identity to make it a bit more open, and to get at the kind of the power relations involved. So for this project that I'm starting and I'm looking into is looking at what I'm calling the feminist game blogosphere. And this is a loose collection of feminist game bloggers connected to each other and that are articulating a specifically feminist gamer identity and are answering back to the kind of post-feminist rhetoric that happens at fan conferences and that happens on mainstream game blogs like Gamasutra or Kotaku or things like that. I have a minute. Good, because I'm almost done. So this is just an example from Geek Feminism. But the main thing is some of these blogs, and it's uneven, of course, because they're blogs, are putting the debate in much more structural terms. And I think that is a productive place to look to new ways of talking about geek identity beyond the hegemonic, white, masculine, straight subject. And so here's some of the game blogs that I'm looking at. Although before I end, I want to give a caution that one thing that I always have a problem with is I tend to study things that I really like. And things that I really like are often made by people who have really similar experiences to me. And so some of these blogs are written by academics, and they're written by middle-class white academic ladies. And so I know this, and I'm working on that. But there are also, some of the group blogs actually have a much more diverse cast of contributors, and there's especially Pretty Gamer and Border House have a sizable portion of their bloggers are women of color. But it's interesting also, like I said, with this project, it's not just about post-feminism, but it's also about whiteness in geek culture and how these blogs interact and maybe don't interact with race in the same way that they critically interact with the gendered images. So that's what I'm working on. I'd love your comments. So thank you very much.
Are these on? They're on? Okay. So you guys can just pass the mics. Questions? And can someone bring up the lights? Thanks, Rich.
It's like a Mara press conference.
What? Yes, John.
Well, first I want to say that was a fantastic panel. Congratulate her again. So I'm wondering, this question is for everyone. Given the overlaps and also divergence of the cost of research in this sort of what we've been talking about all day, kind of, in fact, for all students, where do you see this kind of research fitting into it, like a trajectory that's going to push you beyond studenthood, as you continue into academia, or out into some other realm where this kind of research matters, because, especially given the stuff around trolling or hate speech, which is a real problem in the real world. How does this research fit into what you're I love this part.
How does it fit in the future?
We are the future. You go first.
Oh, God, I don't know, is my answer. I don't know. I really, I mean, especially with trolling stuff, there's been almost no work in this area, even though it's in the news almost, weekly, that some poor kid, their memorial page has been attacked by these trolls. So there's lots and lots of writing about trolling, but very little of it is academic. And the writing that does exist, for the most part, is a knee-jerk condemnation, which I understand, and it's not that I'm arguing that it's awesome, but it's typically, these are bad kids, and we just need to denounce everything that they do. So where that would fit in the academy, I'm not sure.
Beyond, yeah.
Yeah.
Could I just clarify, because I think that this is something that Stacy's presentation in particular points to, and that's the question of impact. on the industry itself, right? You know, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because when we presented at professional or at conferences in the industry, this is a question that comes up, right? Like, how do we fix this? How do we change this? And not because they're really nice and they're liberal people, but because they know that a growing part of their market, right, are going to be gamers or people of color or women in particular. So.
Sadly, I don't think that video games are really taken very seriously in the general public, especially in the academy. And I think that, I mean, part of my slide where I jokingly said I'm justifying my video game research, I think really demonstrates given the economic power of video games, given the prevalence among millennials in particular, as video games being a huge part of their life. Television is suffering in a huge way as a result of the growing popularity of video games. They're struggling to gain a millennial audience. And yet there's very little study on the audience, on content within the games, on really the social impact. So yes, I would hope that the research that I'm doing, and I'm sure I'm not the only person at the table, that it extends beyond an academic audience, and that it maybe even reaches the industry and makes them think about how they're sort of policing the environments, and how they're sort of reinforcing friendly virtual spaces for what is obviously a growing demographic of players and a more diverse demographic of players.
Yeah, I would just add to that Stacey, I always love hearing about your research, because when I was doing my master's research, I wanted data like this. Like, this is a common sense kind of thing that people of color and women talk about experiencing, but there's very little data that you can point to. And, even though positivist sort of like number research isn't what I do, I love having it, because some people will take it seriously in a way that they won't take a more sort of holistic, that's a terrible thing, I don't want to get into a fight, but like a different kind of research that maybe can be dismissed more easily. And also, like, I think some of our research demonstrates that the ways that video games or that digital culture has been constituted isn't inevitable. And we may point to new ways of looking at what's seen as common sense simply because there hasn't been really good critical work done on it that's been circulating, either in academic circles or in industry ones.
Or fans.
Or fans.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for this question. One thing I didn't make very clear in my presentation is why artist video or new media art is so different from previous forms of art. So if you think about a painting or a sculpture, for many years, all kinds of people that were interested in researching and writing about that kind of artwork would be able to often view reproductions in a book. So it's quite different with moving, time-based art, where we can view these still images, but you can't actually view the artwork until more recently unless you were to see it in person. So for my own research as an art historian, that's something that requires that you actually travel to see the work. One example, again, that I didn't mention, but Electronic Arts Intermix is this really great organization which has this amazing wealth of information online in terms of a catalog where you can read all about the artists, you can read all about the artworks. But again, in order to actually view the videos, you would have to travel to their offices in New York, get an appointment with them if you were associated with some sort of educational institution, and then sit there and view the work. So these are things that I think, you could probably tell from my slant that I view the possibility for us to be able to access these works very positive. I'm not taking lightly, what happens when we do convert these files, but I also think it comes full circle a little bit to the original intentions and goals of some of these early video collectives that viewed kind of this new medium as a really democratic opportunity. So that's kind of how I've seen some of these more internet-based platforms. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Colin, do you still?
You go first.
I realize those are big questions. To answer those questions, especially the latter one question, you already have a dominant PhD and spoken, 3 book contracts. But I realize most of you probably were running up to top and I already doing it as well. So I'm curious how that's
I guess I would answer that with another question. Because you're a philosopher, and I like to ask philosophers questions, because they like to ask a lot of questions. But it would be, what is the cultural doing in digital cultural studies? Because culture implies a holistic kind of thing from which something is born, and that's not to say that digital doesn't come from a holistic background. You can't take that out of the digital kind of revolutions and experiences. But it seems to me that when you're talking about cultural studies, you're talking about this holistic thing, studying digital holisticness. And I think what we're doing is studying more of things that are happening immediately, people putting things together at a spontaneous time. And to me, that's more of an amalgamation than a cultural. And so I guess I would then turn that back on your digital and say, well, what about the amalgamation is digital? Why we have to use methodology that takes both of those things apart. We can't just can't take apart the digital and say, well, for me as an anthropologist, ethnography doesn't work for cutting edge technology in a timely way. It would be near impossible for me to do ethnographic work on the Connect. I could play with people, sure, and I could do long-term study later on, but in the timeliness, if this were to die next month, my research would be completely moot. And so, I think it's a two-way street. Is if you want to use the digital, you have to figure out how to use one and talk about digital and not the cultural, or you have to figure out how to talk about the cultural without talking about the digital. And the big problem I think you're hitting on is how to talk about both. And I think that's an answer that I can't give, but I'm stalling for other people to come up with good answers.
Got one. I think actually one of the most interesting things about studying video games is because you can't just use traditional semiotics and just look at them as texts. I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make in doing sort of content analysis in video games is that not everyone is experiencing the same linear path. Not everybody is experiencing the same story in video games. And part of the story in video games, while granted in one way you're looking at an algorithmic world that's completely put together by computer language. On the other hand, there's a very social world happening simultaneously, particularly when you're looking at online or social games. So I absolutely think, and I don't have necessarily those methods yet, but I absolutely think that new methods are absolutely necessary when you're looking at these kinds of interactive environments, that there are things that you need to consider when you're looking at them as texts that you wouldn't necessarily that are different from looking at movies are different from looking at books, that video games are a very different kind of story that people are experiencing. That answers the question.
I would say that for a lot of the stuff that I've done, the trick has been to value the sort of individual. So think about trolls as individuals and wonder why they might be drawn to these kinds of behaviors, but you're also more responsible to patterns and to trends. And so that's where I think some of the research gets a little bit tricky for us, because we can't pinpoint when certain memes or tropes or whatever emerge, that we have to kind of understand or be able to map in a very sort of nebulous way the sort of development of what ends up entering, you know, the kind of the subculture. I don't even know what you would call it. What would you call it? Because we don't, that's the thing, is that there aren't words for the stuff that we're doing quite yet. And so the first issue is, all right, let's figure out what the words are, or maybe more appropriately, let's figure out what the words aren't. And from there, then we can maybe start talking about methodological approaches. But we're kind of, at least I'll speak for myself here, kind of making it up as we go because we don't have a choice. And so there isn't an answer to give. It's kind of, we have to be good at paying attention to traces right now. And that's at least how I do some of my work. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but.
Jonathan, you had, could we, I'd like to get as many people as we can, and we're going to have drinks later, so there'll be an opportunity to follow up on some of these questions. You had your hand up, John.
Uh-oh.
Mm-hmm.
I guess your question makes me think of anthropologists have dealt with play a couple times pretty seriously. I think of Portraits of a White Man by Basso, and this idea that play, one of my favorites, and it's kind of pushing me here to think about my project in a different light, is that play is simultaneously absolutely not true, but still absolutely true. It's a way of safely giving a critique without saying, I'm really critiquing you, but I'm doing it in a way that you don't understand. And so asking a question about Dance Central, are we playing with an irony of whiteness? Like, do people, is this kind of a racialized, like, realizing, as you said earlier, I'm a white boy with a body? Kind of, like, is this supposed to be kind of the stimulating discussion? And is it successful, is then the next question.
I would say that, yeah, I mean, what's interesting for me in troll stuff is that trolls are so aware of their behaviors. They frame their behaviors as play. And the question is, I mean, so Stacy and I have talked a lot about working together on some sort of project because basically I talk about that play frame as they conceive of it, and the problem with that play frame is that it doesn't take into account the real world implications and effects of that play. So trolls are really good about talking about winning the game and the game itself, and even they're aware that it's a play frame. They talk about the mask of trolling. If they're not playing, it's not trolling, but that does not, they sort of cordon off all the behaviors that exist outside of their own enjoyment. And that's where, you know, Stacy examines a lot of stuff, and it's really important to do so, but it's kind of like, where are the limitations of play and what are the real world implications? And that's where the trolls are missing. That's as far as they can take their own sort of self-assessment, is how does this actually impact people in the real world?
a little bit off topic of what we were talking about, but I find it very interesting how many video games where play is actually work. Like in World of Warcraft, you have the crafting where you have to fish and you have to create things, and it's a lot of repetitive, constant activity. And I'm taking Carol's class right now, and she's making us play Frontierville as an introduction to social games. And so as I play this, I don't know if you've played any social games, but I have to maintain this piece of land, and I have to clear grass, and I have to cut down trees, and I've got to harvest stuff. And it's making me feel like I have a part-time job, and I don't like yard work, so it's a really bad part-time job. Granted, I'm clicking on things, and I'm actually in the sun getting sweaty, which actually probably would be more enjoyable. Not that I'm not enjoying the academic exercise.
It's work.
But I've just, and this isn't really an answer to your question as much to say it's an interesting conversation to have about how much play these days in terms of video game really isn't play as much as it's just sort of a reenactment of our life as workers, sort of in a capitalist society. Bryce once joked about really, really bad video games, like the really, really bad video game of being the underpaid waitress, like in a really bad grungy diner. How fun that would be. You just take orders and deal with really, really cranky people all
We were
day.
talking about Minecraft and games that take like the most terrible, horrible, like industrialized jobs and turn them into forms of leisure activity.
Yeah.
But I think just quickly, I think what John was pushing you on, and it was interesting to see how this played out in your answer, was the difference between using play as a descriptive category and using play as a category of analysis. And I think it's something to think about. I think we have, we're time for one more quick question if anyone has it, but it's been a long day and I know we're losing people in dribs and drabs. So I guess we should just thank our panelists again for a great adrenaline panel.